Well, hello, everyone. Bonjour à tous. Thank you very much for being here in attendance, either physically, pardon me, or physically through your virtual connection. And very happy to have Daniel Ruiz Serna with us today. Before, I'm just going to say that I'm speaking to you from an inadequately seated body from unceded Algonquin territory known as Ottawa, the confluence of the Gatineau and Outaouais rivers. And I'd like to say a big Miigwech to everyone who has preceded me, who coincides with me, will outlast me, or who will come after me, regardless of whether our values, interests, and ideas align. And it is my great pleasure to not only have Daniel here today, but also to have Daniel in person to give an actual kind of in situ presentation. So that's going to be great. For those of you who might not know Daniel, us at McGill, we've had the pleasure of having as a colleague and a friend over the years. He did his PhD here at McGill, and he is currently a postdoctoral researcher at the University of British Columbia, as well as the Acts of Listening Lab at Concordia University. And his talk today will be entitled Rot, Feral Animals and Dispossession, Images of the Afterlives of War in Colombia. And I am very excited for this talk. So without any further ado, I'll just transfer the floor to Danielle. So Danielle, whenever you're ready, you can begin.
Okay, thank you, Nick, for that introduction. Thanks everyone for being here. I'm very glad to be here in flesh in this very room where everything started a couple of years ago. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for organizing this event. And thank you for all of you for attending this. So I hope you are hearing me fine. Great. So I'm going to share my screen. Okay, great. So once again, this is part of, this is a chapter of a book I'm currently writing, but it's also part of a paper that is going to be published soon in the Journal of Latin American and Caribbean Anthropology. So it's sorry, here, okay. Okay, great. Now it's working. So without any further comment, I'm going to start. So let me introduce you Danielito. He's a traditional healer and he holds in his hands a stone that he inherited and that he uses to treat snake bites. Okay.
I think you're splitting your screen into two. Is that possible?
I don't know. Well, what I see here in my screen is like the full presentation, but you're right. I'm seeing like in the sidebar the images. Mm-hmm. But is that an issue?
Well.
Just a minute, we're going to solve some technical issues here.
Yeah, maybe we can just not share the screen here. Not share the screen? Okay. So go ahead. Oh, plug yours in so we can see. What does it do for you?
I'm sharing the screen.
So plug this in here so that we can see it here.
I use the slideshow.
Perhaps if it's not already done, engage slideshow mode, if that's the issue about the size. If not, it looks great. I can see two of your slides and then one in feature.
Yeah, this is going to be perfect.
Okay, no, I'm seeing like just one slide.
Can you go to your, if you go to your presentation?
Yes.
Okay, you can start again, sharing screen and see. Yeah, try to share the Zoom.
We'll pause recording.
Great. Thank you. So, can everybody see my traditional healer? Okay, great. Can you hear me? Thank you. So once again, this is my tocayo. He has, or we share the same name. He's Danielito, and he's a traditional healer. And what he's showing us in his hand is a stone, and a stone he uses to treat snake bites. And this stone is kept in a box full of sawdust and is fed with milk and brandy every 4 weeks. And the power of the stone resides in its capacity to suck up the poison contained in a snake bite wound. So healers like Danielito use certain prayers or secretos and a homemade bitter drink, also known as toma. The use of stones, secretos, and tomas for treating snake bites is not completely incompatible with other medical treatments used as venom antiserums. Sometimes secretos and tomas help prepare the patient to receive care in a hospital, although in most cases, traditional medicine proves to be enough. Any help for treating snake bites is very welcome in a region of tropical rainforest that is home to about 5% of all reptiles worldwide. So under certain circumstances, a snake bite might become an even more delicate matter than usual. For instance, for those who had sex the previous night before being bitten, the venom might prove lethal, or at very least, the recovery might be more difficult. Or if one has been bitten and needs to cross a river, the venom will act faster. Or if you manage to kill the snake that bit you, but it dies face up, your treatment will be more complicated. All of these types of events are considered a trauma, something that renders one's recovery more difficult. The word trauma might simultaneously be translated as both woven thread and plot in the sense of a storyline. So a trauma is an event or a behavior that may render a snake bite fatal. It amplifies the effect of the poison, making any healing treatment more difficult by somehow twisting, deviating, or transforming a snake bite's possible outcomes. A trauma might also be conceived as a weft, which has not been appropriately woven over and under the warp yarns. It is a knot, a tangled thread capable of altering the warp and woof of one's life. The image of the trauma as a knot is a useful description because those who are considered the best healers are the ones capable of untying or undoing traumas. Not all traumas, however, are consequences of one's behavior. Some older snakes may have a poison which proves to be stronger than usual, while other snakes may become more poisonous because they have bitten several dogs or people. In those cases, their bites easily become traumadas, so the capacity of inflicting traumas might be a feature acquired through time by particular snakes. Since 2005, people who returned to the hamlets of the Curvarado River, after several years of forced displacement, they noticed an increase in the snake population and in the bites being traumadas, which has rendered the snake bites more difficult to heal with the treatments normally used by traditional healers. The increase of snakes is associated with the ruination of their lands and the presence of oil palm plantations developed by companies that form criminal alliances with paramilitary groups. Along the Curvarado River, thousands of families were expelled and their lands turned into vast fields of palm extending beyond the reach of the eye. Some inhabitants of the region assert that palm ruined and poisoned the land, and that this poison is now, through the snakes, polluting people's bodies. What do these traumas say about the effects provoked by war? Are they illustrating some kind of cultural representation of suffering and dispossession? Or do they express the way in which an experience of violence shared by human and non-humans materializes upon the places and beings that constitute these territories? Let me address these questions by telling something else about the kind of ruination associated to oil palm plantations. As probably you know, these plantations require the remaking of landscapes, the configuration of a terra nullius through the felling of huge patches of natural forests and the violent displacement of inhabitants. Plantations transform forests native entanglements. They are a form of design intended to be immutable and to keep its structural composition regardless of changes in size or scale. As you probably know, under normal conditions, any change in scale or size of a given plantation requires a minimum of qualitative transformation in the form and composition of things. I mean, in the kind of associations that elements are capable of. But that's not the case with oil palm plantations and many other industrial monocultures. They expand by keeping at bay transformative relations among its components. Palm must remain uniform, autonomous and separate from other organisms, and from relationships that might modify their intended outcomes. Such a goal is only possible with the exclusion of the possibilities that different beings have to enter into composition with one another. In the Colorado River, paramilitary armies undertook this task literally, taking away both biological and cultural diversity so that neither people nor forests could transform the plantations. This kind of occupation not only replaces the diverse, heterogeneous, and entangled worlds of forests and communities, but entails an ontological occupation of territories. What do I mean by ontological occupation? On every side of these pictures, different kinds of beings and relations flourish. On one hand, we have monoculture and forest, homogenization and exclusion, diversity and inclusion, salary employees and economic dependency, and food sovereignty and autonomy. On one hand, we have standardization of production, on the other, multiplicity of ecological relations. On the one hand, we have one of the most powerful agents of climate change, and on the other, the place that sustains life in this planet. So transformative relations are the very basis of life, even more in places like forests. The violent ruination of forests and the replication of controlled landscapes produce violent consequences, and snakes might explain part of this story. Research in Guatemala and Colombia has shown that the snakes appear to be adopting the oil palm plantations as their new habitat. Herpetologists have reported up to 38 different species, and they told that palm leaves retain higher levels of humidity when cut, attracting lizards, frogs, and their natural predators, snakes. So evidence suggests that these plantations increase the densities of snakes well beyond the densities found in natural habitats. So it seems that despite all the effort, these plantations have not succeeded in removing diversity. They have just transformed the representatives of such diversity. So palm has not fully dismantled forests, but instead creating new kinds of relationships between their amphibian and reptile inhabitants. So this is my point. There's no doubt that the violent transformation of forests has provoked a lot of environmental issues, from deforestation to diversion of rivers. But the overpopulation of snakes is more than environmental damage provoked by war. Consider this. People in this region are well aware of the existing correlation between the presence of the palm and the abundance of snakes. However, when these communities describe the effects of these correlations in terms of an increased number of snake bites being traumatized, it's not simply that they are using a variation of cultural language to achieve the same conclusion reached by biologists, that because snakes are so abundant in palm plantations, they are more likely to bite people. Instead, changes in the ruined landscapes have led to significant transformation in the potential associations that people, snakes, and other animals may make, a shift that is more than a metaphor. Traumas not only describe the evils of the paramilitary and capitalist forces that stole and ravaged the lands of these communities. Traumas describe a poisonous moment in the associations that humans and non-humans may forge in these ravaged landscapes. So following the tenet that animals and plants are dynamically involved in process of placemaking, in today's talk, I would like to address the kinds of ecologies created, but also disrupted by war. The ethnographic setting of this account is the tropical forest of Chocó, in particular some Afro-Colombian villages located along the rivers that constitute the Low Atrato Basin, or what I refer to as Bajo Atrato. I am to show that ruination is a process in which other than human beings participate, drastically transforming the attributes people associate with some places. This is an examination of war and its in-place ramification that moves beyond the violations of human rights in order to describe what the people of this region are left with in the aftermath of violence. Vibrant ruins, feral animals, abandoned trails, and trees pocked from gunfire are some of what remains. I refer to these remains as afterlives, a concept I use in order to highlight how the material harm associated with armed conflict doesn't cease only because bullets are no longer blowing through the air. So besides being a form of violence reverberating in the lives of people, afterlives are also the kinds of other than human presences that proliferate in the wake of destruction and forced displacement, recomposing the ecologies that make up Afro-Colombian territories. The book I'm currently preparing aims to show that war is seldom an exclusively human experience. Here I illustrate how the abandonment of houses, villages, and gardens has allowed the forest to grow back and its sylvan inhabitants to make their homes there. This is a process that locals describe in terms of ruination, more concretely as a struggle between the warmth people bring through their presence and work and the coldness associated to the forest and the wilderness. War, I learned, amplifies this antagonism. So I'm going to present you a set of different ethnographic vignettes in order to make my claim. So this is the first one. A loud noise that made the ground shake and the roofs move. This is how many witnesses remember the impact of the bombs dropped by the army on that morning on February 19, 1997, when Operation Genesis began. This was a military campaign launched by the Colombian army and conducted in complicity with paramilitary forces. This campaign involved multiple cases of killing, torture, disappearances, and forced displacement of Afro-Colombian and indigenous peoples. In 2012, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights condemned the Colombian state for that military operation, pointing out how in Bajo Atrato some officers in the highest ranks turned a blind eye to the paramilitary crimes and even armed and systematically assisted these criminal groups. So those who heard the bombs mentioned a deafening noise that made their heads expand. La cabeza se le pone uno grande. It's a local expression for describing experiences of great apprehension and fear. The equivalent in English may be something like having one's heart in one's mouth. But in Bajo Atrato, it is said that your head widens as a result of your becoming aware of something unexpected and stressful. In the case of the loud and invasive sound produced by dropped bombs, a head widening is one possible literal effect of an air-splitting blast that reveals the fragility of our human body. Martin Duftree refers to this violent auditory impression as thanatos sounds, instances when listening ends and raw exposure begins, when sounds don't just herald death, but create death through their sheer materiality. In this case, this was the sound of an explosion that also left a rough trace on the landscape. First, it was a crater in the pastures. Now it's a bowl-shaped pond in the forest bordering the Salaki River. This picture shows the very same place 20 years after their strike, the air strike launched by the Colombian army. So although some of the best documented environmental impacts of warfare include destruction of landscapes, plundering of natural resources, spreading of diseases and parasites, In some cases, war has given a reprieve to forests from human pressures, while in other cases, it has created vast zones of no man's lands that, like the Korean demilitarized zone, have become wildlife sanctuaries. This suggests a somehow counterintuitive aftermath. Under certain circumstances, war has enabled the recovery of some species and some environments. However, as Joseph Masco points out, this recovery, often framed within narratives of ecological preservation, hides the long-standing and constitutive practices of environmental ruination so inherent to war, as well as hiding the human suffering that makes possible such environmental recovery. Through the images I just showed, I highlight how war may lead to a double process of negative transformation. First of all, forced displacement and the abandonment of places. Secondly, the flourishing of some other than human presences that in this case are not fully appreciated by locals. This flourishing is often described by local communities as a form of ruination. Consider the two images. The plants and the trees surrounding the pond are evidence of a forest claiming its dominion. But this is a claim that was possible because of the absence of people. This recovering forest has covered the grassland a family had previously sowed for their cattle. If armed people started the process of undermining people's livelihood, the forest completed it. The pastures in the first photo represent the work of those for whom the raising of cattle was a means of subsistence, an activity that required keeping the forest and its inhabitants at bay. In the second photo, this resurgent forest points to a process of ruination, epitomizing the abandonment to which villages were subjected. The bomb is ecologically transformative and relationally productive, allowing new instances of multi-species co-production. In the absence of people, the forest bore other beings, including fish. However, the new pond, formed in the former bomb crater, is not close to the river, and it dries up during summer. And yet, with the rains, the fish arrive. During one of my journeys to that place, one of the locals asked how fish had managed to come to the pond. Someone else answered that some fish hatch from the eggs of frogs. I was intrigued. It was explained that what really happens is that all are born frogs, but some may become fish in the process of growing up. It's a matter of behavior. Some learn to behave as frogs, others as fish, and in the process, their bodies change. I told them I had heard about frogs that estivated. They bury themselves in the muddy ground and are capable of staying dormant to survive periods of drought. I also talk about fish that lay eggs capable of surviving long spells of drought. But my comment was in fact complementing and not contradicting what locals had been explaining. I described a very effective survival strategy, but I didn't explain how fish had originally arrived to the pond, at least not to someone like me who has interiorized that evolutionary principle according to which like begets like. So after some research, I learned that birds such as herons might incidentally transport eggs stuck to their feathers. I also learned that feet and fur of some mammals may play host to fish eggs. So to someone like me endorsing the idea that all members of any species always produce their own kind only, and that fish, therefore, are a kind of an ambiguous organism that can be differentiated from other life forms, this explanation shed light on how fish had come to the pond. But such explanations stem from a particular form of knowledge that defines fish and frogs as species whose clearly identified boundaries are prior to or transcend the specificities of space and time. Consequently, they miss a beautiful interspecies transformation described by locals. The form of some beings, fish in this case, is defined by the relations they undertake. They were born from frogs, but they learn how to be fish, and not the other way around. Again, the form of some beings is defined by the relations they undertake, not the other way around. So under such relational tenet, life is conceived as an incessant birth, and rather than a preordained world of pure actuality with well-demarcated species representing a fulfillment of possibility, one faces something akin to what Ingold describes as a world on the verge of the actual, in which life is not an emanation, but a generation of being. So in other words, species are not already existing in the world, but rather species become what they are by virtue of the relations they sustain. In Bajo Atrato, the aforementioned generation of being is possible not only as a transition from frogs to fish, but also vice versa, as well as between species that one tends to ascribe to different domains. That's the case of some flies, which, according to people, are begotten from the fruit of a particular tree, of some bullet ants that become vines, or of bats that transform into rats. So this constant generation of being presupposes a principle of flux, of constant actualization of the properties that make up a given being. And this process bears similarities to the way in which these communities define and experience the traditional lands. So for them, rather than a taken for granted physical setting, the territory is produced. The territory is constantly enacted through daily practices of arrangement and care. So in other words, territory doesn't come into existence before the relations and practices that constitute it. This means that places like pastures or ponds are instantiations of specific processes in which human and other than human beings participate. Just as fish or frogs become what they are by virtue of the relations, places are an array of activities. They are brought into existence through specific practices. Then the ruination of villages, gardens, or houses is not only the outcome of their physical destruction, it's also what results for the transformation of the species relations these places enable. A house becomes a refuge for annoying insects because, as I'm going to show, therein it's not possible to maintain the practices that bring warmth to places. The forest takes over the pasture because the constituent of the latter give place to other presences, another set of relations. So this is my second vignette. And I'm going to give you the time of reading the quote. So I want to point out to the importance of smoke, which is an index of fire, and the very fire that's used to cook, which is also the fire that keeps the house warm and people alive. So the importance of smoke. And this is the third vignette. This is just an image I call the smoke of life. This is my fourth vignette. This is the red paper wasp. In Bajo Atrato, this is an undesirable recurrent visitors of people's houses. Wasps, flying insects, spiders, and scorpions are all called bichuchos. These wasps have the gift of turning wood into paper, which is the material they use to build their nests. Their eggs take about 40 days to fully develop, a period during which the queen and their female kin enlarge the comb. A characteristic of this wasp is that only one generation uses a comb, so the brood is constantly moving and founding new combs. It has been argued that this is a strategy that they follow to avoid their combs being infested by moths. Moreover, as these wasps don't depend on any seasonal resource for the development, they are building and abandoning nests throughout the year. So multiple comb building and constantly itinerancy is what makes them burglar-like. as the aforementioned quote mentioned. Wasps are always at work, going and coming, looking for the opportunity to seize suitable spots to build their paper towns. The name that identifies their genus, Polistes, means founder of a city. So these burglars are armed. Great paper wasp stings are very uncomfortable. Justin Schmidt, an entomologist who created a sting pain index, describes the venom as caustic and burning. I do know what it feels like to get stung by this wasp. Rather than addressing the pain itself, which Schmidt characterizes at a level of 3 out of 4, my own description would have focused on how much I regretted going into a place where I had not been invited, because the presence of a wasp comb is actually the opposite of an invitation. Even if their colonies might not be big, wasps are dangerous, as they can sting more than once during a single attack. In Bajo Trato, people use the verb clavar, literally to nail, to describe the wasp's stings. Perhaps the wasp's nailing of people is part of the process of nailing down their paper towns. So if there's something that characterizes a deserted building in Bajo Trato, is the presence of this nest. These habichuchos are indicative of how abandonment favors the proliferation of other presences. Another way of saying this is that wasps create another kind of place. When building their combs inside people's houses, they are not just manifesting their natural adaptive strategies. They are, in the very process of crafting these nets, contributing to the emergence of ruined places. Wasps are then participants in process of ruination, a concept I borrowed from an installer who emphasizes the idea of ruin as a verb rather than a noun, which means that ruination is a tangible active force affecting people's lives. So while ruins are sites that condense alternative sense of history, ruination, scholar says, is an ongoing corrosive process that weighs onto the future. Following Gaston Gordillo, I see the durable material traces created by violence as rubble, a concept Gaston uses to deglamorize ruins, which are so often depicted as alluring romantic sites of the past. So if as a modern concept, the ruin establishes a kind of break of the present from the past, an object or situation that is not to be disturbed, but rather to be preserved, rubble highlights instead the materialized ongoing outcomes of destruction and the effects these grim instantations produce on both the material environment and people's lives. Rubble is then an afterlife of war, one that simultaneously evokes the people's many material losses and actualizes the difficulties they face in regaining their agency at traditional livelihoods. If the absence of people's warmth provokes the settlement decisions of wasps, we are not just bearing witness to the way the destructive driving forces of war produce empty spaces to be inhabited by unpleasant insects. Instead, what I want to underscore is the fact that war materializes in the form of debris, abandoned objects, certain more than human presences, and, as I want to describe, in the changing shape of forests. This is a process of destructive production, another concept I borrowed from Gaston, from Gordillo, that captures the twofold moment of war, destruction and production, without recording destruction as creative. It's on account of this destructive production, triggering a violent context, that the sylvan presences that occupy former villages and gardens are interpreted by locals as instances of ruination rather than instances of revitalization of forests. This is my fifth vignette, but okay. Sorry, okay. Fifth vignette. In the absence of people, things tend to rot and wear away faster. If houses and villages materialize the warmth of people, forests, many people hold, exude a form of coldness that can even provoke illnesses. Abandoned settlements with the rotten walls, collapsed roofs, broken floors, and invasive weeds epitomize the coldness that sets in once people are prevented from inhabiting such places. So what sprouts after abandonment is rastrojo. Rastrojo are, in more than one sense, the aftermath of forced displacement. Etymologically, aftermath refers to a second crop of grass grown on the same land after the first crop has been harvested. In Bajo Trateño fields, rastrojos are the weeds that sprout after the harvest, but rather than conveying the possibility of a new crop, they anticipate the resurgence of forests. Similarly, abandoned villages open up venues for rastrojos to set in, and with them, a powerful force of coldness that consumes the warmth of people and their activities. Rastrojos are thick and invasive. In local parlance, the verb enrastrojar describes the process through which the rot sets in, a process that in tropical rainforests occurs in an extremely accelerated way. Rastrojo is the feral, vegetal form that ruination adopts. It is what many villages became after they were forcibly abandoned. So those villagers that came back found their houses enrastrojadas, full of weeds. But as not everybody could or wanted to come back to their land, many houses, and in some cases entire villages, were literally devoured by forests. In Bajo Trato, one might be struck by the apparent absence of ruins, but in fact, these ruins are there. It's just that their form is not always that of decaying infrastructures, but of flourishing forms of life that, like rastrojos, reveal the force forests have to dispute the boundaries between wild and domestic spaces. How then to know when one is surrounded by rubble? I started to consider this question during a trip up the Arenal River. On my way, I was with a friend and we passed through some small villages, including the abandoned village where Miguel, my friend, was from. As the river began to narrow, I started to feel happily overwhelmed by the thick trees growing on the banks and by the shape of their canopy covering the river's course. It was as if the forests were closing in upon us. Then my friend Miguel pointed out a dense green spot behind some shrubs and told me that that used to be the very location of his plataneras, his plantain gardens. While my gaze had been focused on an unrestrained forest, Miguel was noticing the process through which his former gardens disappeared at the hands of the wilderness. Miguel's gesture made me realize that the existence of that exuberant forest was in fact favored by forced displacement, bringing into focus the historical and social context of a landscape that I otherwise would have taken for natural. So to put it in other terms, that particular forest has a negative relationship with people like Miguel. It developed out of moments of violence and for displacement, actualizing the abandonment of villages, crops, and animals. So despite the abundant forms of life that a forest favors, some of these forests come to embody abandonment. They are the materialization of the violent process that force people to forsake their livelihoods. In many cases, war just accentuated the process through which forests are constantly disrupting stewardships of the land and disrupting people's labor. What I mean by disrupting is that people have to work hard in order to keep it from taking over their gardens and crops. What I describe as disruption is the dominant process of forest regeneration people must deal with in order to preserve houses, villages, and trails. Let me give you an example. During the conversations I held in Bajo Trato about the effects of forced displacement, one of the topics raised several times was the loss of caminos, of trails or forest tracks. These trails have been opened in order to connect villages, to allow people to go to work in their gardens and fields, and to make it possible to enter the forest to access game and timber. I use the verb to open to describe the work of creating such trails, not only because this is how people conceive of these tasks, abrir caminos, but also because it captures what this work entails in a place where the perpetual growing and quick sprouting of plants often obstruct, say, trails. To open trails is then to make the forest accessible to the circulation of people and their animals. To open trails is to trace a thin line on the ground that allows people to traverse the thick growth of trees and shrubs. To open a trail, someone explained to me, is to give warmth to the forest. So trails actualize people's presence in the forest. Trails render possible the transit among other beings and forces that also move in the forest. So I interpret trails not as an attempt to occupy or transform forests, but as a request to safely move through the forest and let the warmth of people flow inside the coldness of the forest. A trail allows people to live next to and to travel through the forest. Trails are transitory, and transit is part of keeping them alive. When people use trails, they are cutting the vines and removing the fallen trunks and branches that impede passage. Without maintenance, trails will disappear. Trails, in short, are possible because of the presence of people. Otherwise, the forest will easily cover that tenuous line of footsteps. And the importance of actualizing or renewing what I consider a request to the forest is somehow captured in this image. Like trails, a bridge without transit is doomed to ruination. Though it still works as a bridge, allowing us to cross the creek, the surface of this bridge looks more like a lot full of weeds than a piece of human engineering. The presence of these plants is indicative of the absence of people transiting and therefore maintaining those trails and their bridges. Where does the bridge start and the weeds end? This is, I think, not just an aesthetic question. See, these plants are helping decompose the bridge's wood and rendering it dangerous to be crossed. In another setting, perhaps in a Chinese or Japanese garden, the aesthetics of the bridge will seem the masterpiece of a skillful gardener, as it will synthesize the spontaneity, roughness, and rusticity Buddhist philosophy associates with nature. But here, the presence of the plants, at least from the perspective of the people using the bridge, doesn't give life to the bridge, but subtracts life from it. The weeds in the wood epitomize decay and the abandonment of trails that war had already made impossible. Sixth vignette. When the paramilitary violence began and compelled people to leave their homes in 1997, most of these people left behind not only their houses and belongings, but also their livestock, poultry, and other companion species. In their accounts of their multiple losses, many people included dogs, poultry, swine, pack animals, and cattle. While cattle were stolen and swine and poultry were slaughtered by the paramilitary armies, other animals were left to their own fate. They went to the forest and they se encimarronaron. They became marooned or feral animals. A couple of friends described to me their surprise at finding several of these animals alive when they returned to their villages after 2 years of forced displacement. Horses, dogs, and some pigs managed to survive in the wilderness. But when the first families came back, these animals gave up their feral status. According to my friends, the warmth of people brought them back. In 2004, 7 years after the massive forced displacement, during a trip I made up the Quiparado River, I saw on the banks of the river one of these marooned animals, the most imposing cat I have ever seen. I was struck by the presence of such a magnificent cat in the middle of the forest. Not only his size was unusual, in its gaze, there was a kind of nobility exceeding the usual dignity that only cats know how to display. Someone in the boat explained to me that the cat belonged to one of the families that used to inhabit one of the abandoned hamlets we had just passed, and that the cat probably came to the riverbank attracted by the sound of our outboard motor. The cat's good shape was proof of how fine he was doing in the forest, but his presence there and the steady look he gave us while the canoe passed by was a reminder that the cat was, after all, a creature whose sociality was shaped by human presence. The figure of the maroon, that runaway slave who retreated from the colonial war, but became maroon as a consequence of abandonment. And yet, this solitary feral cat shared a characteristic with some of these runaway slaves. Their lives in the forest set them apart from their own kin and kind. Let me explain. In 1966, Cuban anthropologist Miguel Barnett published the testimony of Esteban Montejo, a runaway slave who spent several years in the forest before joining the army that fought in the Cuban War of Independence. Montejo describes how he lost all contact with people, not only through the act of escaping from the sugar plantation, but also during his time in the woods. Out of fear, he avoided encounters with both the officials of the colonial order and with other enslaved people. The former could bring him back to the plantations. The latter could betray him and indicate his location. He said, "I didn't even allow other cimarrones to spot me. Cimarron with cimarron sells a cimarron." So a true cimarron learns to live in the wild in the absence of his own kin and kind. Similarly, without human caretakers, the cat learned to survive in the wild. And once in the forest, he didn't have the chance of finding kin or any other creature of his kind. The mutual relations that allow people to establish companionship with certain non-human beings is depicted in this map, drawn by some women from a village in the Salaki River. It represents how their village looked before the forced displacement. Besides a soccer field, several houses, and some gardens, the map includes 2 different kinds of forests and the names of some trees used for timber, along with some fruit trees, mangoes, guavas, lemons, coconuts, and some medicinal plants found in the gardens that women used to keep. The map also shows horses, poultry, cats, and dogs, the typical companion species of peasant life. Plants and animals are included because they are constituents of the village and to some extent, part of the community. Through this map and the stories of marooned animals, I have realized that because of war, people lost many of their non-human companions, just as many of these beings had to learn to reconstruct their lives in the absence of their human kin. Almost done. Thank you for your patience. This is the last vignette. Trees respond to inflicted damages in an incredible way. They wall off the affected tissue. Agroforestry experts say that, at least technically, trees don't heal, rather they seal. Unlike many other living creatures that heal by repairing or replacing the damaged tissue, tree cells seal off the wound in an attempt to impede decay or the spread of disease. This process, known as compartmentalization of decay in trees, is how trees respond to the impossibility of reanimating a wounded part of their bodies. So trees literally embrace the wound. They seize it eagerly and enclose it by building healthy tissue around it. This is exactly what these trees have done with the bullets lodged inside them. The trees were heavily pocked from gunfire. The tissue developing over the wounded bark is evidence of the traces left by past violent encounters between guerrilla and paramilitary armies. Each bullet provoked a wound that opened the tree up to box and decay. But tree cells halted the spread of damage by forming a strong tissue that encapsulated the bullets. The immediate surroundings of each embedded bullet are dead. And yet it's just that tiny zone encircling the metal that these iron pellets succeeded in killing. The forms emerging from the trunk are made of new layers of wood and bark. They bear witness to a story of military violence, death, and resilience, but also of coexistence of the living and the dead. In land surveying, a witness tree is a tree used as a reference point to define a boundary. Witness trees is also the name given by some historians to trees that, because of their location, bear witness to historical events. Often located on former battlefields, these trees are commemorated because they hide within their trunks the material traces of historical combats. In both cases, trees are considered witnesses because their presence establishes and bears out some kind of truth. But it's not just memory what is encapsulated in these trees. I mean, these trees are not just tenacious wooden symbols of the past. Instead, these trees retain, expose, and even amplify the material traces of war. The ordnance embedded within these trees' bodies discharges emotional effects of war. It retells tales of suffering. It reminds us that our violence can happen again. When the forms of trees emerge as a result of mortal encounters between enemies, perhaps some of that violence remains alive. I think that attention to these emerging forms may shed light on how the presence of military debris sustains a certain state of vulnerability and uncertainty. As noticed by other anthropologists documenting the material left behind after war, to people who live amidst the rubble and waste which remains after conflicts, these traces actualize distress and fear, or even release other forms of material melancholy. Wartime doesn't cease because bullets are not ripping through the air anymore. Military waste, even in the form of exploded ordnance embedded in trees, is a constant reminder that even if armed confrontation has stopped, some of that violence stays near to people's lives. It's, after all, part of the material form of trees growing at the center of the village. So to conclude, in Bajo Atrato, the forest and its thermal properties are at odds with the efforts made by people to render places suitable for human endeavors. As I showed, this antagonism between the warmth of people and the coldness of wilderness is amplified by war. Consider the outcomes attributed to forced displacement. Without the warmth and care that human presence and labor propitiated, houses were reduced to rubble, gardens decayed, animals were marooned, and trails were lost. Persistently sprouting forests are part of local ecologies, and people have managed to organize their labor and places in order to keep the wilderness and its coldness at bay. But ruinous versions of forests emerge in the absence of people. The progressive return of communities to their homelands has been a means for people to retrieve some of their agency and exert their granted territorial rights. But it has also been the best way to take care of the territory, since it's the presence of people that is conducive to a version of forests better attuned to the kind of life these communities want to cultivate. So to some extent, the territory is the result of an intricate set of responsive practices between human and other than humans, practices through which Afro-Colombians are constantly creating new arrangements with the plants, animals, and other beings that make up these territories. Through rubble, rastrojos, and feral presences they favor, one realizes that places are in motion, or that they are moments in the arrangement of things, which also lead us to consider that rather than a physical setting taken for granted, territory for locals is always in the making. Life, many scholars have pointed out, is a multi-species arrangement. War is too. Forced displacement and dispossession occur in concert with humans and feral animals and vegetal species. War triggers new kinds of multi-species arrangements, we locals have difficulties relating with the animal and vegetal presences that come to settle in abandoned places, remind us that, as pointed out by Darcy D'Angelo, armed conflicts don't simply start and end, but rather nest and beget new kinds of disputes. The intricate role of sylvan agents in the decay of people's livelihood on one hand, and the proliferation of beings whose presence trigger a far off cold that harms people and places on the other, point to a process of ruination that involves more than material losses. This in turn renders more complex both the definition and redressing of forced displacement and dispossession, which, at least legally speaking, currently tend to focus on the material dimension of this phenomena. Even if forced displacement can be historically locatable and defined as a moment of rupture and loss, dispossession cannot be understood as confined to a single event, but rather must be seen as an incremental and cumulative process that involves the action of feral animals and vegetal agencies. The proliferation of these beings and the kinds of obligation, values, and relations they report complexifies the dialectical relation between the intended outcomes and the fortuitous consequences of war, which means that even if dispossession was a deliberate goal of the war waged against these peoples, the agencies that participate in such process don't necessarily follow the master plan of the human actors that wage war. In Bajo Trato, people and forests are caught in violent histories of dispossession. When abandonment and rastrojo come together, they create places in which forests don't simply manifest their regenerative tendencies, but in which war instantiates its pervasive afterlives. If rastrojos are the aftermath of forced displacement, and if aftermath is a weedy harvest, the environmental consequences of war can hardly be interpreted by locals in terms of a flourishing, harmonic nature, no matter how thick and big is the forest that an outsider sees. This should provoke second thoughts when examining the ecological footprint of warfare, or the way armed conflict has given a reprieve to biodiverse areas for human pressures, because what emerges out of rubble resists to be framed within the terms of ecological opportunity or environmental harm. Beyond what Singh calls this hope versus terror dichotomy, beyond that dichotomy that portrays nature as a theater of military operations or a silent victim of conflict, as in Colombia has been said, we should instead examine the kinds of feral ecologies that war renders possible, paying particular attention to the agency that more than human entities manifest, as well as to the historical entangled relations local peoples web with the living constituents of their territories. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And I don't think much patience was required, but I'll say you're welcome. Thank you for your very evocative and captivating talk, as well as, I must say, your striking images you shared. We'll open the floor to questions. And I see we have a clap in the chat. And a little emoji clap. Can live a few minutes for some questions. I have a few questions already up in mind. I might at least 15 seconds before I ask mine. I have two questions. One, I'm not even asking 15, not even waiting 15 seconds. One question is a bit more precise about path making, but the other one perhaps is a bit more. It could foster greater discussion, and this came to mind when I was watching the trees sealing over the bullets, and I thought of the heat of bullets, the hot lead or whatever metal they use for that nowadays. And I thought then of the kind of notions of Cold War, hot war being the kind of the somewhat literal explosion of tension into armed conflict. And that made me think of kind of the not necessarily a dichotomy, but this dualism of the heat, the smoke. Smoke even comes out of barrels of guns, but of human presence, of domesticity on the one hand, and then the coldness of wilderness on the other. And I was thinking, at first, well, how could and this is perhaps more philosophical than anything else, but I was thinking, how could the heat of domesticity be somewhat of a good thing, or at least favorable for the well-being of humans in a place, but then somehow that heat be so destructive, at least for those humans, right? And I was thinking, what are your thoughts on that? But also, would you think there'd be something to look at in terms of thinking of that war and violence as something that is perhaps like a grotesque saturation of humanity, or at least some facets of humanity, in such a way that kind of exceeds the ability of that place to foster well-being for humans. Too much of one thing leads to that thing not being able to continue existing as well. It's just so I don't know if that's a question or a thought, but yes. So I guess perhaps a question while we deal with feedback would be, do you see any link or resonance between the heat of domesticity and the heat of violent conflict?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. There's a bit of feedback. Don't exactly understand that.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, with feedback.
We are not hearing. Hey, but Nick is talking and we cannot hear.
Go for it. We'll have to switch between the two.
Okay, so I'm going to try to address your question, which I can't actually. I mean, like, it's a good point. It just makes me think something we discussed with other people when I worked there. We were locals referred to armed groups as the people of fire. And we used to make this joke that there are like 4 elements of the cultural diversity in this region could be represented by the 4 elements. So in Afro-Colombians were the people of water, because their intimate relation with rivers. Indigenous peoples were thought as the people of earth, because they are the ancestors and the historical inhabitants of this region. The armed groups were the people of fire, because there was literally firing on people. And international corporations and ONGs, we were all people of air, because we are always like thinking about abstract ideas and not really helping people there. So we are kind of ethereal. But I think that the thermal argument I try to develop, it's like it's I mean, like it's not doesn't work for like every single activity of any of the endeavors people have with the forest. Because, for instance, in order to heal some diseases which are considered cold, they have to go to the forest in order to bring some plants that are considered cold. But even those plants that are considered cold, some of these elements are considered warmer than others. For instance, the root can be considered colder than the leaves. And in the transformation of a plant considered cold, some of these of their warmth properties come up and help to alleviate cold or warm diseases. So this is just to say that it's like kind of it's not an absolute boundary between the cold and the heat, but it's always like moving forward. But I really like the idea of the heat of the bullets and what this heat is doing to the trees. Perhaps I have to give like further thought to that. But thank you for inviting me to think or to consider this, Nick. I know that as usual I didn't address your question, but it's always a trigger to think about more stuff.
Thank you, and thank you for corresponding with me on this. I think questions are very rarely answered. They're kind of trailheads. So thank you, Danielle. Does anybody else have a question at the moment? I will try to be more patient this time before jumping in with more questions. In the meantime, Carolina said, Danielle, very interesting as always. Got to go, but please keep us posted on when you'll be publishing this very interesting project. I believe that's related to the book, which is very exciting. So I'll stay true to my word and wait a few more seconds. Colin.
Yeah, Danielle, thank you for really a rich talk, and building on some themes that have really impressively informed your previous work. But I also was very interested to see you have a bit of a perspective on palm oil production, which of course is a phenomenon, monocropping in so many forms, a phenomenon which globally has displaced land-based communities. And I'm just curious how far you've looked into palm oil production elsewhere in Southeast Asia, for example, or literature on monocropping in various contexts.
Now, can you hear me?
Yeah.
No, not really, Colin. Not really. I'm afraid, like even the example I presented here, I took it from my book manuscript, because I felt that I have to study more than in order to say something like real, like creative about the palm oil monocultures. I use like that vignette in order to because this story about the snakes, like it was like I felt like it was very, very powerful. Like these snakes illustrating that trouble relation between peoples and these ravaged landscapes. So like it has been very well documented, like the environmental impacts. But this thing about like the snake bites being more poisonous than before helped me to think that people were facing the aftermath of these monocultures in ways that resisted to be framed with the language of environmental damage. And this is like the starting point I used to try to think like in the ontological dimensions, but more concretely, the kind of interspecies relationships that these monocrops were generating. But I don't want to recast like this destruction as creative, as I said, but I think that is enabling like some new instances of interspecies or multi-species relations. And yeah, this is like the excuse I use in order to try to develop my argument. But it's just the oil palm. It's just my excuse my excuse in this case. But yeah, I've been reading like a lot of work on palm oil, but I haven't visited the region, the Bajo Trato, this particular place where this palm was introduced. So I'm not feeling like full confident talking about or further elaborate the argument on these plantations.
Thanks. I'm going to apologize in advance. So I've got a grant application deadline, and I'll have to leave in a few minutes. So.
Oh, well, thanks for attending, Colin, and good luck with the grant. And before moving on to Alonso, thanks for your question, Colin. Okay, and then Carolyn. So it'll be Alonso, then Carolyn. And sorry if I was distracting while I did this in front of the screen. If anyone saw that, there was just a wasp on my sleeve. So I forgot to show that. Okay, Alonso.
Daniel, thank you so much for your presentation. Hi. I've been thinking a lot about beauty and pain and how some things are incredibly painful and you need something to imagine a world on the other side of loss, right? So there's the kind of need to reinvent beauty when faced with devastation and destruction, the need to imagine the possibility for some kind of life on the other side of loss. And I thought that this is just an introduction to how your presentation is working on me. I thought your presentation was really beautiful in that deep sense of being nourished in the meantime, right? You don't know what world comes after loss, but you need to eat so you don't lose faith, right? And so I thought it was like really beautiful. And it left me thinking, so this is more of a comment, but it left me thinking about the tree and the snake as bodies that absorb violence. And you don't give us an image for what violence makes the snake's poison more poisonous. We only know the effect, right? Like that the expansion of palm oil plantations and also the situation of war have made snake bites more poisonous as per the experience of people around them. But you do give us an image of the bullet going into the tree and of the tree encasing the bullet, creating some kind of extra folds of tree skin around the wound to continue living, right? And so this made me think about the different ways in which violence moves through bodies as another way of imagining the relations that make up a place as kind of the gift of your presentation. And I was also left thinking with this kind of, and this is much more of like, I'm jumping to another kind of, I'm moving scales and going to another kind of set of concepts to think with. But it left me thinking, just because you talk about coldness and heat, about the concept of specific heat, which is a concept that describes the speed at which different kinds of matter absorb and release heat. So it made me wonder, you know, what ways for thinking about how violence moves through bodies are coming up for you in this kind of wonderful work of describing these very difficult vignettes of what life means after war.
Thank you, Alonso, for the comment. Wow, like like you point out to something very powerful and something that I have to confess once again my ignorance. I haven't give so much thought, but this idea of how violence moves through bodies and like it's something like the affect theory is telling us, like affect moving through bodies. Yeah, this idea of violence moving through non-human bodies, like how to account for that kind of violence, which means we need. I think that I didn't succeed, but I think that with the images, with the photos, I try to convey another kinds of meanings, or the photos are like conveying another kind of text, because I cannot always rely on words in order to describe what people are left with. And I think that in the case of this violence moving through bodies, like perhaps we need to engage with another kind of not writing, not even writing, perhaps with another means of representation. I have been thinking about the use of sounds, for instance, to convey that kind of stuff. I have been thinking about it. I'm supposed to do that during my postdoc. I haven't, but it's something that as you mentioned, like yeah, like deserves like deep thought. And yeah, I'm going to leave it there.
I thought the concept of trauma was really helpful, like T-R-A-M-A, trauma, in that it like trauma makes snakes more poisonous. And then my question is the bullet going through the tree a kind of knot in the fabric of that tree's life? But the tree, that trauma doesn't make it more poisonous, right? Somehow the tree does something with that trauma that makes it occupy a different place in human life. And so for me, that was the moment of being like, wow, there's a lot to think with there.
I received that just like as an invitation. Thank you, Alonso. Like it's a very nice comment. Yeah. No, I leave it there. It's a very nice invitation. I have to give further thought. Thanks for your comments and your kind words, Alonso.
Yes, thanks also, Alonso, and sorry for the noise. I won't be speaking that long, but on top in Zoom, it says, playing music? No, this is just the sound of a two-stroke engine. Caroline.
Hi, Danielle. It's good to see you again. And that was just such a great presentation. And every time I hear you speak, I'm really amazed to see how your research is evolving. And I just was very, very impressed. And I'm seeing more and more similarities between our work. And I wanted to share a small story. When I was in Madagascar, working on the Rio Tinto mine, a lot of local people were complaining that an environmental change arising from the mine was creating a formerly estuarine freshwater, saltwater mixing ecosystem to change. And there was more freshwater coming into this ecosystem, causing crocodiles to emerge in the ecosystem. So there were more and more crocodiles. And there were kids going in to catch fish in these areas, and the kids were dying. And news of this was reaching the capital of Antananarivo, and no one would believe it. It was just this kind of local myth. But when I went to go interview people, it was true. I mean, it was actually a real impact, and crocodiles are in that. So, and it's true that when you do increase freshwater into this ecosystem, you do get more crocodiles. So I was thinking about the snakes, and I was working in rice fields. And when you do palm oil is kind of like when you clear for rice cultivation, you have to clear a lot of land. And that's when the snakes come out. And I remember there being lots of snakes. And whenever you have a big environmental change like that, these other species start to come out, and you get all of these multi-species interactions that are interpreted by the local people in these different ways, and in some means ancestors, right? So, and when you talk about the ancestors, that's when you're getting into the whole ontological and cosmological world of people. And I think you're right, when we talk about dispossession, we have to start talking about the ancestors as well. We can't just talk about dispossession in terms of land and the environment as though it's this material object. We have to talk about what happens when there's an environmental change leading to more snakes, more crocodiles, more, lack of access to medicinal plants, which means that people might not have medicine or something to fully understand the extent of the impact. And that's why I think what you're doing layer of the ancestral, like the ontological dimension, the multi-species interaction. So I really appreciated your work, and I hope we can continue to stay in contact about it. And I'm seeing so many similarities in Madagascar with the spiritual dispossession side of things too. So there has to be a way to talk about this more. So bravo, thanks. It was more of an elaborate comment, but if you have, thank you again. 2 thumbs up.
Well, thank you, Caroline, for your beautiful words. Thank you for, this thing that you say, this sad story about the crocodiles. I have a couple of examples also about some like animals, about wild animals that became wilder. Is that the right adjective? Of wild animals going wild because of human actions. So the point, like some of the points I try to do is like, if we are talking about or embracing these ideas of multi-species interactions, of these ideas of nature cultures, or nature culture as always like one single thing, we have always to think about aftermath or the consequences of war, or in this case of development, in hybrid terms. So it's not just like there's like the environmental things going on one hand and the cultural and human aspects on the other. Like they are always entangled. So we have to create like means to think about the hybrid and always multiple consequences of this kind of I have arrived to the point in which I see or I try to see always this is why I don't use the word aftermath, but afterlives. They are always hybrid, like nature and culture are, if we accept that divide or whatever, we engage with that kind of concepts, like those things are always like deeply entangled and I think that my point in the Colombian context is like to try to complete or render complex some of the legal procedures regarding reparation and justice in these territories, which are addressing on one hand the human rights and on the other the environmental consequences, or at the best they are like dealing with the socio-environmental consequences of war. Mm-hmm. But I think that they still reproducing the divide between nature and culture, and a divide that doesn't make sense among many communities, and a divide that, as I try to show, is not useful to understand what people are left with. And thank you for your encouraging comments, Carol.
Yeah. Thank you. And like last very quick thing is that if I think there's so much potential for interdisciplinarity as well, because if you take this work and then apply it to environmental history and see that people were talking about, oh, there were many more snakes than we could think about, oh, well, maybe there was this environmental change that occurred, or there was I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud, but there could be a lot of potential for multidisciplinary action. So.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, you're right. Just like perhaps like my comic project is like I would like to do like some kind of account of war, of history of war through a multi-species lens. As I say, like if we have already accepted that life is a multi-species project, I want to see war and art violence as a multi-species project too. But what I want is like to there are many examples of animals used in war as weapons, but also animals as victims. But again, I think that this is a way of, again, like creating a kind of divide between like nature and culture. So I'm trying to develop like the means to understand, like to use all that stuff we learn about ontology and multi-species ethnography, but to see armed violence through those lenses and see what we can learn about war and wartime and aftermath and trauma and of course justice and everything. Well, thank you, Caroline, once again.
Yeah, thank you, Danielle and Caroline. Also very just interesting to see some of the resonances that can happen into very different places. Of course, floor is open to more questions, but perhaps in the meantime, I will ask a question. Danielle, so I guess it's kind of two questions. You can answer them both or neither, or one of them, or anything else. But one thing I thought of when you were talking about trail making, or like of how it's somewhat of a request, and that makes me think a bit of, you know, in my own experience of not necessarily making trails, but of following trails, and of course the following of a trail being contributing to the continuous emergence of that trail, but where we might not necessarily make a request to a spirit or a spiritual entity or a place, but something almost somewhat similar to a request can happen. I don't know if it's a surrender or something, but it's an honoring, at least, that happens in a not so transactional in the interaction, but there's a loose understanding that proper physical interaction with a place of worship while you're on the road, while you're on the path, but also a proper engagement with a certain personality associated with that place or with the places through which you're moving, will favor safe travel or anything like that. So I guess long-winded kind of prologue to asking you whether or not there's any, if that request that's made, if there's any engagement with any kind of spiritual entities or spiritual forces in that way. And also in just a little vein beside that, Afterlives, which I think is a great way of approaching what you're doing. It makes me think of course, death, and then afterlife, which to some extent mixes with my like Judeo-Christian like upbringing of actual lives after death, which makes me think of also again that spiritual dimension to things, or at least like ancestral. Is there any have you come across any actual dead human or dead animal or dead plant interaction with the kind of ongoing afterlives of war? So sorry, two kind of questions there, but yeah. And then Esteban.
Just a short answer. Yeah. I have a chapter working about where a massacre was committed. When people returned to their lands, they found that in this place, the spirits of the dead people were somehow trapped. And people have to learn to deal and to negotiate with those spirits in order to help them to reach the afterlife. The interesting thing about that story is that the spirits of the dead people here are the spirits of paramilitary soldiers. So the very people responsible of the violence and the forced displacement of communities. So communities have a big deal or a big issue trying to relate with these spirits. But they are aware that in order to heal their lands, they have to deal with these spirits, even if those are the spirits of the bad people. So yeah, this is just one example I'm writing about, but there are cases in which, like, I will call them like, haunted places or enchanted places where violent death took place, and like the characteristics of these places change because of those events, and people have to learn how to find new ways of dealing with what is left in these places. In some cases, it's in terms of the spirits of dead people. In other cases, it's in terms like a malaire, they call them, like a bad environment, an heavy atmosphere. So yeah, so there are cases in which, like, actual, like, spirits or spirits of human beings in this case who haven't reached the afterlife are trapped, like, in the world, in the forest, are waiting for people to take care of their spirits and help them reach the afterlife. And the other thing about the requests in the forest and the trails, not all people, but many people, when they are going to the forest, try to or take some measures in order to protect themselves from, like, the bad presences in the forest. For instance, it has been suggested to me to, if I want to make, like, a good long walk in the forest, to have a little bit of salt in my pocket in order, like, to repel, like, bad energies. There are people who actually know prayers, or secretos as they are called, to avoid the encounter with spirits and bad spirits that live in the forest. I didn't document a lot of that, and in a particular case I don't talk about them, but there are multiple instances in which like people have to take some measures in order to protect themselves from the spiritual energies, and also in order to repel like the animals and powerful beings that are attracted when people are transiting the forest.
Very interesting, thank you, and a lot of resonance with some of my own experiences in Mongolia, and also some of my readings. And if you'd like, I can send you try to find you a passage that talks about haunted places in a somewhat of a similar way as you're talking about. Esteban.
Hi, thank you, Nick, for inviting me to this talk. It was really provocative, and this notion of the afterlife is wonderful. So thank you so much, Daniel, for your presentation first. And I just wanted to basically ask you two things. The first one was, you probably have thought about this, so I just wanted to pick your mind on the relationship between the idea of rastrojo as the weeds and the paramilitary group called Los Rastrojos, which is, I think, a very powerful metaphor, that on one side. And on the other side is this idea of cimarroneria, or the marooned animals, which you relate really interestingly with cimarron people in the Caribbean. And I was just wondering if you know the work of Ángel Quintero and his ideas of cimarroneria as a as a dialogic tension with slavery, and he studies it in salsa dancing and dance, embodied this came to mind because of Alonso's question about embodied afterlives. We could call them like that, like this idea of carrying the memory of, for example, slavery in a new, once you gain freedom, you know. In this case, it's a bit different because it's these animals that have been either displaced or dispossessed, or these non-human agents that have been left there. But at the same time, this idea of cimarroneria as dance, as an embodied dialogic tension with those memories of slavery, is very evocative and could add to your thought. So I just wanted to pick your mind on these two ideas. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Esteban, for the comments. Angel Quintero, what you described like ransom bells, the name no, but like this idea of this dialogical tension, yeah, perhaps I have heard about it. But the thing, someone who read like a previous version of this paper, let's call it, told me like the comparison between what's going on with the feral cat and the cimarrones and the maroons. It's like was a little bit problematic because cimarronaje, the maroon, was not always like an individual experience. Like the case of Montejo in Cuba is like this exceptional guy who decided to live alone in the forest. But that was not like the norm in the case of maroon communities, where we are talking about a whole bunch of people living together and creating villages in the forest, etc. So that cimarronaje was not just an individual experience like the one I'm referring to. But again, like I just found like I could make that connection somehow, and I define that connection. But we have to bear in mind that the case I'm discussing is like exceptional in the sense that cimarronaje was like a collective experience. The thing about rastrojos and the paramilitaries, so just a little bit context, there are some kind of remnants of these mobilized paramilitary armies that kept their weapons and that never demobilized, and they call themselves rastrojos. And the name is very symbolic in the sense that a rastrojo is what we sprout after a forest or after a harvest. So these armed people is what is resprouting after the mobilization or after the falling of the big armies. So it's like there will always like be this seed of violence growing up, no matter how many peace processes we sign. I don't know, but it's something I have to consider. It's something I would like to write, not only in the sense of these armed groups call themselves like rastrojos, but also in the case of like paramilitary commanders or guerrilla commanders adopting or alias or calling themselves with the name of animals, and what they are conveying by using those name of animals to call themselves. And this is like another kind of relation between like animals and non-humans and violence, and as the use of the names, or even there are many examples of high commanders with the powers, with shamanic powers, the powers of transforming themselves into banana trees or even butterflies and jaguars, etc., etc. So there's a lot to discuss there. But I thought, I haven't discussed it, but I have thought about the relation between rastrojo and this emerging paramilitary violence, which is very symbolic. And thank you, Esteban, for your words.
Yeah, thank you, both of you. Alonso, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I thought Esteban's question was like really provocative. Oh, what? Okay. I thought Esteban's question was like really good to think with. Previously, I had mentioned this kind of concern with the way violence moves through bodies, and it makes me wonder also about violence moving through generations, right? And it reminds me a little bit of a book by Fred Moten called In the Break, where he picks up a conversation with Sadiya Hartman from a book called Scenes of Subjection, where Sadiya Hartman is trying to think about what is the afterlife of the psychic life of power in the condition of being enslaved, and how does that afterlife get worked out in North America. And they're both kind of interested in this moment from the diary of Frederick Douglass, where he registers the experience of hearing his Aunt Hester being whipped and her screams. And for Fred Moten, a big question becomes, what is this kind of recording, right? And how does registering this, what is the afterlife of this kind of violence? And he tries to engage with the question of what he calls a broken breaking sociality, and what, after thinking with Nathaniel Mackey, he calls the sexual cut and wounded kinship. These ways in which perhaps something like drama gets folded not just into an individual body, but into the relations between people, and how the afterlives of this require some kind of not just productive endeavor, but also perhaps a creative endeavor, right? Who tries to think about how certain forms of artistic production, like music making, in some way, generations afterwards, respond to these wounded histories of sound, or the histories of wounding that become effective in sound. So I was, like just pointing that out as something that feels interesting to me, and thinking about what is the life of that when you don't just think of the connections that matter as being the connections between people, but when you think of the connections that matter as being the connections, say, with a witness tree, or like, what kinds of adjudicative thinking, what kinds of ethical, political reinvention become possible in paying attention to rastrojo, or in paying attention to the ambiguities and ambivalences of these traces, which is not really a question, just sort of appreciating the very subtle thinking that I see happening in your conversation.
Daniel, you're muted, just in case.
Someone here in the room has a question.
Yeah, so well, the question has to do with, first of all, an excellent presentation as always. I'm really learning so much about your work, and this has been a really ongoing conversation for several years. So you keep like finding new stuff every time I hear you. So this is great, stimulating. So the question has to do with how you're defining war. How a little bit of perhaps an invitation to push the idea of war a little further, even because you are taking war outside of certain disciplinary way of thinking about it, at least in the Colombian context, which is, okay, war, it's about destruction. You're here teaching us, showing that the war is also about creating places, creating ecology. So it has a sort of a productive quality to it. So I wanted to ask you, what is distinctive about war that is, because I mean, any kind of human disturbance is creating also ecological relationships of many different kinds, extractive economies, any kind, a chagra in the forest, any other. So what is it about war and the kind of ecological relations capacity that makes it different from other kinds of human disturbance? Because I mean, then the kind of the question there is also, because in the case of Colombia, at least, I know that in this region, war and extractive economies are very entangled. So war is not just an operation of physicality. It's not just about destruction itself, bare destruction. There is a sort of a political. It is entangled with other kinds of stuff like extractive economies and such. Paramilitary groups being a case in point, they are created to protect landowners, enterprises, and such. But what is it about, let's say, kind of the ontological dimension of war that not only takes war outside of a disciplinary sociological gaze to kind of give it a space in a more multi-species conversation, but what is it that set it apart from other kinds of disturbances?
Such a good question, Ivan, like usual. Yeah, as you pointed out, like there are these, I would say, like marriage between extractive development and war in Colombia. I think that what sets war apart from other kind of human activities, disturbing landscapes, I would say, like perhaps it's the intensity, the speed, or the rhythm of this violence, and the violence itself, like the means used to. Extractivism disrupts ecologies, but But I think that war, like the goal of war is the physical elimination of not only enemies, but wherever the machine war finds in this way. So I think like the difference with other kinds of projects or destructive projects, I would say like is the intensity, like the speed and the violence are the three things that come to my mind. Perhaps we have to define those things with more accurately. And I take that question as an invitation to redefine and to try to make my own definition of war, because I have through something I have been working is like the exploration of sounds. I've also like for instance in sound studies engaging with war, for instance, the sounds that are privileged are the sounds of weapons, for instance. I have read this incredible paper saying like we have to try to find other sounds that also are related with violence. What about the cries of a woman crying because her sons were killed? Those are also sounds of war. And I've been thinking, okay, what about the sounds of particular birds, of the sounds of the snakes, of the trauma of these poisonous snakes? Is that a sound of war? If we embrace those other kinds of sounds and other kinds of consequences, we should also embrace and elaborate a new definition of what actually war is, and when wartime starts and when wartime ends, if it ends or not. So again, so thank you for the common question. I take it as an invitation to think about and to conceptualize like what war is. But thanks for.
Is there a space for another? So entangled with that idea, so we know that in Colombia at least we have all these law codes, criminal codes and decrees and very substantial things being created and in moments of conmoción interior, states of exception. It's like it becomes sort of a rule in Colombia to create institutions being used to gauge war against communities and kind of interrupt the business as usual to create legal order and stuff. So I was also curious to learn how war it's becoming sort of in what you were describing, a sort of so constitutive of life, of in the Colombian case, that you cannot really make then it becomes tricky, because then you have to talk about the kind of sort of a very tricky, profound, dark stuff, which is what is the ethics of it, If work has not only this capacity to create landscapes and new relationships through the ethnographic vignettes that you have shown us, but it's so embedded, and it's tricky because we have all these old stereotypes about Colombia being so violent and people being so violent and reactive. But it seems that order has emerged in these different ways, that there is a continuity between war and life in this way. I don't know. War and peace.
Right. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you, Iman, for those great kind of contributions and questions. And not that this would add that much, but Daniel, your thoughts of kind of differentiating that through speed, intensity, and violence. Also, there might be kind of an idea of I don't know, time scale. Well, I guess that answers in the speed, that's velocity, but also time scale of those impacts, and also kind of the not of the, but also to consider the actual, I don't know if directionality would be the right word, but it seems to me like in extractivism or monocropping, there's a very explicit intentionality of transforming the landscape in a particular way for a particular purpose. Whereas in the war, much of that transformation is likely collateral. However, there's of course collateral transformations in in those intentional projects of terraforming. And of course, there's probably, I imagine, at least that sometimes some intentional landscape transformations in war. But that's just some few extra thoughts on that. Also, just Amélie, before leaving, she had said she had to go, but thanks so much. It was wonderful. Can't wait to read the piece when it's ready. Also, you might be interested in a book called Decay, edited by Hassan Hadje. There's a text on the aftermath of war in Sri Lanka that deals with similar issues, she thinks. So yeah, thank you very much for that. And Alonso says, thanks. I really enjoyed the presentation and questions and comments. I should be going, but I don't want to miss saying that I appreciated coming to this talk. And I think that is very much shared across the board here, certainly from my end. And there might be more questions, but I have a feeling this is a natural kind of point where the end becomes a new beginning. And you've left us with a lot to think about. And I think, even though he's gone, Alonso, what he was talking about, the beauty in all this and kind of finding a way through horror or loss through some beauty, it really resonated with me, at least through this, whether or not it's a need to do it or whether it's perhaps something inherent in it that we can perceive. I don't know, but thank you for showing us some beauty without hiding horror. So I really appreciate that, Danielle. And so thank you very much again. And thank you everybody for having come, being in attendance. We have more talks throughout the semester. Stay tuned for invitations for those. Our next talk is next Friday. However, to be honest, we'll have to confirm whether that talk will happen. The speaker has, without getting into personal details, there are some stuff that you can find online in the news. The person has gone through some difficult experiences recently, so we'll see if the talk will actually occur. But regardless, stay tuned. And once again, Danielle, thank you very much. And thank you everyone at Peterson Hall, Carmen and Nathalie and everyone for making this happen. All right, well, I will stop recording and wish you all a wonderful day. Feel free to linger on, but recording is now stopping.
Thanks, Nick.